live for another Austro-Thomism Round table. We have Gold Guy, AnarchoCatholic, and Bulgakov at available username on Twitter. How you guys doing tonight?
I'm doing fine.
Pretty good.
Can't complain.
Cheers.
I'm ready to be taught just how little I know.
Me too. So,
Caleb, I can't hear you.
yep, I had.
Yep.
Apparently, the space bar is linked to my mute button, and I hit it with my hand. So, just gonna put that away. I'm very professional, so here, guys. See, I dressed up and look professional, and I mute myself. It's
We'll fix it in post. Don't worry about it.
I've also
we're
also
live,
dressed
bitch.
up. I've dressed up. I'm wearing a shirt. This is all
Actually,
you get.
real quick on that whole live thing, that's like my favorite Joe Rogan moment ever. Is this guy starts telling a story, and like, who was the guy? It's like, I said his name. Say his name, and he says his name, and 5 minutes later implicates the guy in a crime. He goes, "Actually, can we take that on post?" And Joe just like, "We're live, bitch." And it was just the funniest moment to me. Anyway, we're going to cover the 5 proofs of the existence of God by Edward Feser. We're not going to cover all 5 because we don't have 5 hours. So we're going to cover the first 2, the Aristotelian proof and the Neoplatonic proof. Before we hop into the actual book and the arguments, we're going to say a little bit about Ed Feser, and we're going to say a little bit more about kind of the jargon we're going to use to find some terms, because it gets it starts simple, then it builds to get kind of complicated. This is why reading is super helpful, because you can work your way into it. But in a conversation, I can imagine it's going to get 0 to 100 real quick. And I want to make sure the audience can follow along and understand what we're saying. So, anybody want to go first and describe Edward Feser at all, or to talk about him a little bit?
I can talk about him very briefly. So he's around now. This book is from what, 20? I don't even know the date. Recent.
Last 10 years, somewhat
yeah,
time.
2017.
Okay.
So
More recent than I imagined.
Yeah. So he's in his 50s, Catholic philosopher. I think he's at Pasadena City College in beautiful Pasadena, California. Got his degree at UCSB. Very right-wing, very Catholic. Writes a lot on politics and a whole lot on Aristotelian and Thomistic philosophy. Like any good Catholic, I think he's got a handful of kids that he lives with in LA. And yeah, I want to say, and I might be just completely making this up, but I'm pretty sure I remember listening at some point to Tom Woods does his like Proof of God episode or something. I think he references Feser, and I think they've been in touch at some point. I think he
directly references this book, and Feser has written a few things for the Mises Institute, because Feser, I remember he has a book on Nozick. I think it was one of his first published books. It was just a book on Robert Nozick. So he has some.
He was a libertarian for a while, I believe.
Yeah, he still kind of is. He calls himself a conservative now, but he'd be a conservative libertarian essentially. But he has direct arguments against Rothbardian and anarcho-capitalism. But I think Woods, at least when that episode aired, called him a friend. So, and he directly uses the argument of this book, or at least I shouldn't say the argument of this book, the formulation of the argument from this book.
Go, guys! See that eye on the chat. You guys better not finish that sentence.
It's okay. I'll just use the responsibility with Anglo, who I would.
They're just spelling Nissan. That's fine.
if we can just get 6 live viewers that are in the chat, I'd be happy. Whatever they want to spell.
That's fair. So I figured let's define some scholastic metaphysical. Let's define some terms real quick. So terms we can probably throw around are cause, causation, potentiality, actuality, forms. We'll talk about these guys. Anybody want to go forth and try to define these terms before we go forward?
Causation, right? Okay, let's start with causation. I think Eincap might be better at this than me. But for all right, the very, very basics of causation requires us to get into 2 other related terms called potential and actuality, or actual and potential, I should say. So, okay, how do I put this? Actual is whatever is at that moment. So, for example, you have a cup of coffee. That cup of coffee is actual. It has a certain temperature. That is the actual temperature. But whatever can happen to that thing is potential. So, in it has the potential to go hot or has potential to go cold. If it didn't have that potential, it can happen to it. Feser has a lot of arguments to this effect in scholastic metaphysics, and he goes at length on this, as well as he goes through the recent analytic philosopher literature outside of these scholastics and neo-scholastics, neo-Thomists, and what have you, to see that they also essentially, a lot of them also arrive at a similar conclusion of causation, that this is, they call it dispositions instead of potentials because they don't like the scholastics, because the scholastics are religious. But it's essentially the same thing, except with a few other flaws that the potential actual distinction doesn't have. That's the very basics of causation. And if we want to be even more specific, that would be effective causation. That wouldn't be formal, material, or final causality, which is a whole other can of worms that we can get into if you want, but that's the basics. It's the actualization of a potential within a substance. That is the basics of causation.
Makes sense to me. Everybody, Gold Guy, you following this? Everybody else is following this so far? I want to make sure everyone here is following.
I'm just nodding along.
I'm gonna, and that was very good. Bulgakov, I've been told I've been pronouncing the name wrong, so I'm gonna try and do better about that. But yeah, just to add a little bit to that is the nice thing about all these proofs is they try and start from premises that you can't really argue with, that everyone sort of sees in the real world. In this case, we can start from physics and say, okay, we know that things are. That's something that everyone can manifestly see, and we can see that things change. Things aren't always the same as, you know, there is change that exists in the world.
Parmenides has entered the chat.
And just to get BTFO'd, really.
Pretty much.
But from that, we can deduce, like Bulgakov was saying, is that, okay, things are actually the way they are, and they can potentially be other ways. And this is going to be, we're going to have the related idea of form and matter, where form is the way something actually is, and matter is the thing that can persist through changes. I think we'll probably end up talking on form and matter in a little more detail, probably with the Neoplatonic proof. When it comes up a little bit more. But, you know, form is to actual as matter is to potential. Is sort of the right way to think about it. Is that things are some combination of form and matter, and that they are something, and that they can be something else.
Okay. Well, if everyone's good to go, let's just get into the argument. Who wants to go first and try to explain or succeed in explaining the argument? Be positive here.
Should we go through? This is just a question. Should we go through Feser's 50 steps?
Yes, but maybe stop along the way.
Yes.
So I think, and I would suggest, a little bit of information about how the book is structured we're going through the first two chapters here. We presents two different natural theology arguments for the existence of God. And just a little bit more background. Idea of natural theology. We are not going to make any reference to revelation. We are not going to make any reference to any kind of faith-based understanding. This is rigorous scientific construction of why we should think God exists.
Which is where I came at it from.
And this has been my biggest approach. There's a whole other conversation to be had about nice ways to sort of get to why you should think there's a God. But understanding the sort of natural theology arguments, I think, is a key one. But what Feser does is looks at 5 different proofs. And the way he structures each chapter is he gives a rather long, fairly informal description of each individual proof, trying to give nice examples, trying to sort of give you some knowledge of the philosophy that he's using along the way. And then afterwards, he gives a much more condensed and concise, here's the actual argument step by step that we go from, you know, our premises to an understanding that God must exist because of these reasons. He then provides a list of objections following the Thomistic model and tries to counter those. So I think that the idea is, at least for the first proof, we're going to try and go through that abridged, condensed list of here's the core argument for what he calls the Aristotelian argument for God.
Yeah, Max, I think I can see if I can do this real quick. Actually, page 38. I got the PDF downloaded, so I said.
Oh, you do? Yeah, I didn't know if you had it because you like reading actual physical books. So I didn't know if you had it.
I don't like reading.
I sent you the entire 50 steps through the chat on Twitter while Ein was stalling.
The page froze on me here. I'm sorry, I can fix this.
PDFs are the work of the devil. Embrace luditism, whatever you'd call it.
He says on the computer live stream.
Yeah, I don't know I don't think it's the work, guys. I just have, for some reason, it's like stuck on page 45 and not changing.
You can just go on Twitter and go to our private chat.
That might be better.
I've DM'd every single one. You can just open image in new tab.
Oh, there we go.
Way ahead of the game.
You are on the ball tonight.
Yeah,
Let's share the
well,
screen.
I've noticed we sometimes have technical trouble, so I've decided to preempt some things.
Let's see here. Share screen. Okay, can everybody see that? Awesome.
Yep.
Who wants to go first and read them?
Who likes reading?
I will read so that
Mhm.
I can actually contribute something to this and not just sit like a dumbass. Number 1. Change is a real feature of the world. 2. But change is the actualization of a potential. 3. So, the actualization of potential is a real feature of the world. I'll just stop reading the numbers. No potential can be actualized unless something already actual actualizes it, which is the principle of causality. So, any change is caused by something already actual. The occurrence of any change C presupposes something or substance S which changes. The existence of S at any given moment itself presupposes the concurrent actualization of S's potential for existence. So any substance S has at any moment some actualizer A of its existence. A's own existence at that moment it actualizes S itself presupposes either the concurrent actualization of its own potential for existence or A's being purely actual. If A's existence at the moment it actualizes S presupposes the concurrent actualization of its own potential for existence, then there exists a regress of concurrent actualizers that is either infinite or terminates in a purely actual actualizer. But such a regress of concurrent actualizers would constitute a hierarchical causal series, as such a series cannot regress infinitely.
Mm-hmm. All right, there's quite a few things we can explain there before we move on, actually. So if you want, we can either remain there or we can read all of it if you prefer.
If
you don't mind, let's do like the 2 or 3 more and just get to the, I think it's 14 or so, where he establishes the purely actual actualizer.
Oh, okay.
And then, because then after that, he goes into the divine attribute. Yeah. So like 3 more.
Okay, that's true. That's a fair point.
So either A itself is a purely actual actualizer, or there is a purely actual actualizer which terminates the regress that begins with the actualization of A. So the occurrence of C, and thus the existence of S at any given moment, presupposes the existence of a purely actual actualizer. So there is a purely actual actualizer.
All right. And then he goes on to argue, there can't be 2 of those. It has to terminate into 1. The reasons for doing so, and so on and so forth. So he uses that to also establish the divine, divine simplicity, oneness.
Correct me if I'm wrong. There cannot be 2 purely actual actualizers, because for there to be 2, one of them would have to have some distinguishing feature.
Yes.
Which would require some potential that is or isn't actualized.
Yes.
Therefore, it cannot be a purely actual actualizer.
Pretty much.
That part was super helpful.
Actual actualizer.
That part was super helpful to me because I argue. I have several like neoliberal friends who are like atheists or agnostics, and they want to talk God, and I'll make like unmovable argument or the Kalam cosmological argument or something along those lines, and they're always arguing always results in, well, why couldn't it be polytheism or something? And this point here about why it can only be one an actual actualizer to cause it, and things that come along with that are super helpful, and really it's a solid argument. Like it doesn't work any other way.
Yeah, I had that question about polytheism in particular, but then I realized that just kicks the can down the road. It just
what actualizes them? Yeah.
Something needs to actualize them. So it just brings us back once again to the purely actual actualizer, the one single purely actual actualizer.
Yeah. I was gonna say something, but I forgot what it was. Let me check my notes. You were correct. It has to have that differentiation, and in fact, it's actually a good question to see can it be more than one, because there is an actual fallacy by a Thomistic, which was coined by a Thomistic philosopher, Peter Geach, who I've recently written an article about, called the boy and girl fallacy, which some thinkers make a mistake like this. For example, the proposition every boy loves some girl doesn't imply that there is one girl who loves every boy, or who every boy loves. So it's a similar thing. So the fact that everything needs an actualizer, you need further premises that Feser provides that would say that there's only one actual actualizer. Instead, if you just say for every x there is a y, it's not necessarily the same y for every x. So it is an actual fallacy that you can fall into if you're not careful. So it's good that Feser spent quite a bit of time making sure that this is not the case here.
We have a question from the chat. Why couldn't it be the infinite regress given tautologies, hope I say that word right, are descriptions of the actual?
So actually, this is a good question. Feser, I think, he gives a decent enough explanation of this in the book itself, but I think he goes much deeper into it in the, Scholastic Metaphysics. But just to stick to the simple version of the book, a hierarchical causal series must terminate. It doesn't any series, he says, a series in time could extend infinitely back into time, but that's not what we're talking about. For there to be any sort of causality, effective causality at least, you need something which has derivative causal power in itself. So, for example, he gives us an example in Scholastic Metaphysics. You have a hand, you use this hand to pick up a stick, you use the stick to move a rock. The stick has no power itself to move the rock unless there is a hand moving it. This is effective causality. This is what modern philosophers would just mean when they say causality, because they don't really give attention to the formal, material, and final. So this really needs either a first term or something outside of the sequence itself, which gives it causal power. For example, if you have an infinitely long, this is an example from Garrigou-Lagrange, another Thomistic Dominican friar from the 20th century. He gives the example that you can have an infinitely long paintbrush, but it's not going to paint itself. You need someone outside the paintbrush with a derivative causal power to cause it to do something, or else it will just remain inert but be infinitely long. But it will be inert. It's not going to do anything. So that he uses the language to simplify for the reader hierarchical causal series, but what he really means is essentially a series of simultaneous causal effects of effective causality. Essentially.
And to give a little more detail here, is Feser goes into some time to distinguish between temporal causal chains, which he calls linear causal chains, and hierarchical causal chains. So you can have this idea that, okay, like I'm trying to think what's one of the good temporal examples. Like I think he uses like making tea as an example or something like that. That I can go in, I can harvest tea, the tea can be put in a tea bag. I can boil water. I can put the tea in the tea bag, and there's this chain of causes in time which causes the tea to be brewed. And he gives no reason in theory that this chain couldn't extend infinitely far back in time. That the leaves could have grown because the rain fell on them and they were planted and they came from a previous plant. And he says in principle, in theory, there's no reason we don't necessarily think that couldn't go on forever in time backwards. That's something I have a hard time sort of wrapping my head around. But in theory, we could have an infinitely old universe. Distinguishes that from this hierarchical, what he calls hierarchical causes. That something is held into existence or caused to do the thing it's doing by something else at the same time. And Bulgakov makes the great comparison to the person holding the paintbrush or the person using the stick to move the ball. The other and this is similar to one that Feser uses. If you imagine if you're in a dark room and see a length of chain hanging down in front of you, and you can look at the bottom link of the chain. Okay, why isn't it falling to the ground? The link above it is holding it up. Okay, well, why is that one not falling to the ground? Well, the one above it is holding it up. And no one would ever think, well, maybe the chain's just, I can look up and it's into the darkness. No one would think that the chain was infinitely long. Everyone sort of concludes at some point something different must be up there. We don't suspect, just based on our understanding of the world, there is something different at some point. Just because the chain might be very long or it might go on.
There's a ceiling.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. There must be a ceiling at some point, because it doesn't make sense for there to be that infinitely long chain doesn't explain why the chain's hanging there in the first place.
Yeah, it can be it has to be a ceiling, or at least it has to be it can be an infinitely long chain, but it has to be like hanging off of something that is a full stop somewhere, even if it's outside the infinitely long chain.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Aquinas believed he could not prove if the infinite past or the finitude of the past through philosophy. I remember reading that somewhere. He did not. Was why he wasn't convinced by the Kalam argument himself, because it was.
That sounds probable, because I think Feser quotes Aquinas at length. Surprise, surprise, in Scholastic Metaphysics, and he sort of makes Aquinas rejected the idea behind Kalam he doesn't go deep into it. At least Feser doesn't go deep into it with the quotes and analyses of thereof. But I think the Kalam was fully formulated a bit after Aquinas, I believe by Bonaventure. I might be, and that was, I think, like 80 years after he died or something. But there were some ideas from some earlier scholastics which he sort of rejected for the simultaneity of causes, of effective causes in a sense. So any accidentally ordered series of causes, again, this is different. There's essentially ordered and accidentally ordered, but just to accidentally ordered is something which, for example, there is a father who has a son. After the father has the father can die, the son still exists. But if for some reason I am holding the stick which moves the rock and I don't move it or I die, the stick is no longer going to move the rock. The latter is essentially ordered so that you need the earlier terms in the sequence, and the former is not. So that after it happens, they have some connection through time and through at one point one caused the other, but from then on they have their own derivative causal power to act in the world. So that one can extend infinitely. You can have an infinitely long line of fathers, of sons, and each term dies as the next one is born. But you can't have an infinitely long essentially ordered series. It has to have something which imparts causal power to every other term in the series, or else you have nothing. Or you can sort of, I guess, take a Spinozan line which takes everything as causal power in itself, because it's all one substance and it's a sort of monistic view of the world. But then there's other arguments against that.
22 minutes in, that might be the most heavy philosophical counseling we've had on this podcast. So let's go.
It's only going to get worse from here.
Yeah, we haven't even gotten to the Neoplatonic yet, man.
I'm looking forward to listening to that one, but not contributing. Sorry, go ahead, finish, Caleb. I'm happy to state that I can follow what you're saying, just not say it myself. So good on me.
That's fair enough.
Are you going to say Eincast?
Yeah, so this kind of a tangent, but I think it's very interesting. Like, if you go back to, Feser calls this the Aristotelian proof. Like, the ideas go back to Aristotelian philosophy.
Yeah, the physics and metaphysics specifically.
Yes, books. Correct. But the ancients were very comfortable with the idea of an infinitely old universe. That didn't really bother them at all, too much. I mean, they sort of that was their worldview, that the universe was infinitely old. And again, St. Thomas comes along and says that very well can be the case. We can't really argue it. I find it so interesting that in the 20th century that we have the discovery of redshift of galaxies, and this idea that there's a lot of reasons to think that there was a temporal beginning of the universe. That this wasn't a pretty powerful moment for natural theology, in the sense that not even it doesn't even seem like these infinite temporal chains can exist, because there was a 13 whatever billion years ago. It looks like there wasn't anything before that. What caused that? So because now you don't know how you can't even say, well, the universe has just existed forever and has been forever. You have to say, okay, something happened that caused the Big Bang to occur. And again, it's you could have other explanations before that, but if there is a beginning point for the physical universe, it requires a cause. So it's weird to me, because people will say the universe, the Big Bang or something like that, being this sort of atheistic argument, and I see it as exactly the opposite. Is you've sort of eliminated this confused but commonly cited objection to these causal chains. Is not even your temporal causal chains seem to be infinite.
And wasn't the Big Bang the term and the argument first created by a priest? I remember reading
the earlier formulations were from a Jesuit, oh how far they've fallen, priest.
My friend, when I told him that, was because he's a huge Stephen Hawking fan, and he attributed Big Bang to Stephen Hawking.
No, Stephen Hawking did formalize and make the modern theory and make it whole. I will give him that. From what I understand, I'm not a physicist, so I might be speaking out of my ass here. But from what I understand, he deserves a large amount of the credit. But the earliest formulations of the theory that I know of in modern science was from a Jesuit priest.
Yeah, and the earliest experimental evidence, I think, was there was a monk communicating with Einstein as he was looking at the motion of galaxies and saw, hey, it looks like everything's moving away from us, and got in touch with Einstein about it, and that's where that idea sort of originates. Hey, if we just go back in time, everything was a lot closer together. And that's, like I said, that dates back to Einstein's general theory of relativity, so 20s, 30s, something like that. But yeah, that was those first astronomical discoveries were made by a monk. I think it was a monk.
Atheists screaming and crying right now.
Anything more to say on these the first 14 steps of the 50-step argument?
Let's see. I think we've handled step 1, 2, 3, 4.
Hold up.
But we might need to say something. Yeah, we've handled step 1, 2, 3, 4 because it essentially says, okay, something actual needs to actualize a potential.
Mm-hmm.
A potential can't actualize itself. We've explained that you need to derive causal power. Either a thing has causal power in itself, in which case we would say it's purely actual, or it's already or it has causal power imparted upon it, like I imparted to a stick moving a rock. Let's see any substance.
We have a comment here I want to display. A Big Bang, could this be one of those ceilings where the infinite chain is limited, but the chain can still extend beyond that, so to speak? Which I believe some people have the view that our universe came out the death of a previous universe, or was a branch of another dimension.
I'm perfectly okay with let's say Roger Penrose's theory of I believe it's cosmological cycle, something at CCC, which is essentially your infinitely recurring Big Bang and then eventually an end of the universe and then another one. I'm okay with that. I don't have any problem with that. I think that's a problem for the empirical physicists to figure out. I'll leave that to their domain. So I'm only too happy to announce that I don't care. It doesn't affect my argument. Maybe Einkath can object, but it's not something for pure philosophy. It's something really for you. In this case, the physicists do have one up over us. They do kind of have domain over this problem and not us, unfortunately.
And as Feser points out repeatedly, and as we started with, it could be the case that the universe is infinitely old. That does not affect the argument whatsoever. My point was just that if you do have a clear beginning for the universe, it even makes the argument, puts it even it destroys that objection even more so. But yeah, it's very clear that you could have the universe could be infinitely old. You still have this hierarchical chain that cannot be infinite.
Mm-hmm.
Whew, okay then. Where were we before that?
So do we want to go ahead?
Explain? Let me see. Oh, and yes. And essentially, Feser argues, this isn't how he gets to step 14, which is the purely actual actualizer, that the only way that something can have causal power imparted into itself, or to have causal power as in itself purely, is to be purely actual and have no potentials that need actualization. Is to not be able to suffer change and to be eternal. And he essentially, and so you go back eventually, and you go into essentially you keep asking what actualizes that, what actualizes that, what actualizes this actuality, what actualizes this actuality, what actualizes this actuality at every moment of existence, and you eventually arrive at something that has to be purely actual in that it's self-explanatory. This also connects to the principle of sufficient reason, but that's for way later and not for this live stream.
Oh boy.
Okay.
Oh, I've discovered a new reason for prayer.
Must have praying to understand
The
this
great
book.
thing about St. Thomas is that you can actually pray to him. He is a saint.
You don't even pray and be like, hey.
You can ask him for help. You can ask him to pray for you.
Fine, let's pray. I understand your arguments, please. That would be great.
I think we've gotten up to step 14 unless someone has other comments, which I think are the most important steps to understand, because everything else sort of follows, I think, which are the divine attributes, essentially.
Right, because and I think a lot of the arguments sort of follow a similar, if I remember correctly, is it establishes the existence of a thing. In this case, it's the pure act. It's the completely actualized actualizer.
Actus purus, yeah.
Yeah. And then everything after that is okay. Well, what can we say about that thing? And he uses those to establish a lot of the divine attributes. And you sit there and say, okay, well, we know that we've concluded this thing exists, and we notice that it has things like omniscience, omnipotence, omnibenevolence. It's like, okay, yeah, it's this thing that we could exist starts to look a lot like what we would think of as the Christian God.
Those attributes were actually the attributes were one of the things that was kind of bothering me after I concluded, yes, there is probably a purely actual actualizer, but does it?
How do you get there from Christianity? Yeah.
Now I actually read the Thomistic argument first. I said this is a good argument for a purely actual actualizer, but how do we know it's intelligent, omniscient, benevolent? Then I read the Aristotelian proof. Actually starts the book at the beginning. I said, "Oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense."
Yeah, it's the simplest proof, I think. In many, it's the easiest to get, and it's the one that comes from most. It is, in a sense, because the Augustinian goes into forms and what are forms. And that requires a lot more metaphysical background for him to talk through. This one is like, change is real. Here are the implications of that. It's complicated, but it's the easiest one. It's one of the most undeniable premises, I think.
Yeah. It's born
Even
out of common sense observations.
Even someone who's a pure nominalist or conceptualist and doesn't really, and it's not a metaphysical realist, doesn't believe the forms are real, has to kind of give it to the Aristotelian proof. I think it has way more power. It's much more non-controversial, I think.
Yeah.
In fact, it's what convinced Antony Flew, the famous atheist philosopher, that God exists. He didn't become a Christian, but he did read the original Aristotelian proof at like age 70. He's like, yeah, I was wrong. God does exist. Which is really funny to me.
Yeah, I had a similar reaction. I just said, I finished reading the Aristotelian proof and just went, okay, God exists.
Yeah, no. His reaction was much the same because he hadn't read any Aristotle before then. He was a world-famous philosopher, but he mostly engaged with everything after Descartes, also known as modern philosophy. And so when he actually went back and read Aristotle, he was actually convinced, like, no, actually, I've changed my mind. I am a theistic. I'm a philosophical theist. I do believe God exists. Yeah. I'm not convinced of Christianity, but I do believe God exists, which is, I gotta hand it to him. That required a lot of balls because he lost a lot of credibility and a lot of respect for that.
I think Feser writes about him in the beginning of The Last Superstition.
Yes, he does.
Which
is a very good job.
This is a great book we should eventually cover as well. That's a really good one.
I mean, we've arrived at the existence of God. The rest is just aesthetics, and Catholicism has 100% has the best aesthetics.
We do. Yeah, I mean,
so, decision made there.
In Protestant buildings are like what next to the Winn-Dixie and the shopping center, and the Orthodox buildings have these giant ice cream looking cones sitting on top. I mean, come on, we got this. It's in the bag.
I mean, maybe Islam is worth a look. I mean, a few dozen wives sounds nice.
All right,
listen to Jeremy and Continentalist. He makes it to mystic argument for polyamory.
No, he makes it to natural argument for accepting polyamory, but it's on the sacraments. Let's not strawman Jeremy here. Anyone listening, that's a fun episode. Definitely listen to that one. Yeah. But yeah, we're ready to get into the divine attributes.
Let's do it. Let me bring back up the page here.
I'm actually surprised we managed to condense scholastic causality into 30 minutes. It required way longer than that for me to understand it.
Okay, we were on the second page, 15, I believe, right?
Correct.
Yeah, everything after 14.
Okay, then let's share screen. Let's get it up here. Okay, you can see it.
Yep.
There we go. Who wants to read the next set?
Let's continue with Gold Guy. He's done a great job.
Yes.
I know.
Gold star.
I'm surprised I can actually fucking read. In order for there to be more than one purely actual actualizer, there would have to be some differentiating feature that one such actualizer has that the others lack. But there could be such a differentiating feature only if a purely actual actualizer had some unactualized potential, which, being purely actual, it does not have. So there can be no such differentiating feature, and thus no way for there to be more than one purely actual actualizer. So there is only one purely actual actualizer. In order for this purely actual actualizer to be capable of change, it would have to have potentials capable of actualization. But, being purely actual, it lacks any such potentials. So, it is immutable or incapable of change. If this purely actual actualizer existed in time, then it would be capable of change, which it is not. So, this purely actual actualizer is eternal, existing outside of time.
I think you want to stop there where we talk about the first two divine attributes, which are, I guess, oneness, just being one, and the second eternity, or being eternal.
Sounds good.
Because I think I'll actually have to ask maybe Einkaf or one of you, because I've actually forgotten the whole reasoning for potential is what differentiates, because it's been a while since I read it. I've been reading scholastic metaphysics since then. But does anyone explain it in succinct steps, or am I going to have to derive it in front of the audience right now?
I kind of want to see you go through the derivation yourself.
I'm tempted to as well. I'm interested.
So, but the general idea is that again, to be two, like it says, there's going to be some differentiating feature. So if there were two purely actual actualizers, one would have one actualized feature, the other would have a different actualized feature.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
Otherwise,
okay.
otherwise it wouldn't be in pure act. So you have the first one could be the other one if its potential was actualized in the way that made it the other one.
Mm-hmm.
And
but
so
there is no such potential that can be actualized.
Right,
it's just actual.
It wouldn't be purely actual.
Yeah, if it had the potential, it would not be purely actual. So there can only be one purely actual actualizer. One of the ways that I thought through this while reading it would be, again, bringing back to polytheism. Like, why can't there be two of these? Oh, well, if there's two of these things that we're considering, there would just have to be
another purely actual thing,
a real purely actual actualizer before them to make them, so they'd just be subordinate. So it just brings us back to the one purely actual actualizer.
Okay, yeah,
there can.
It's a good way to think of it.
Another might be like you think, okay, if there were two, is you could ask why is this one, and that one, and you have to give a cause for that. There has to be a reason for that distinction. That probably goes into a slightly different one of the proofs, but you still have to point to, okay, what is it that causes that distinction? What causes one to be one and two to be number one to be number one, number two to be number two? And then you have to point to something that actualized them, so they weren't unactualizable. They weren't pure act, or they had to have that potential in themselves, and then they're also not pure act.
Okay, so we've got own oneness of God, and now eternity. I realize that a lot of profs talking online, not a lot, but some have problems with this. With God being outside of time specifically, because a lot of them without knowing it, are theistic personalists. So they imagine that God is just it's like a mind, like your mind, but without a body, and really powerful and awesome and cool. Yeah. I'm not saying all prots are like this. I think the Lutherans are far closer to the Catholics on this, and maybe others. I'm not that. I'm raised in a very Catholic environment, so I am not an expert in Protestant theology by any stretch of the imagination.
Most parts I know and deal with, they really how to put this, when they talk about God, they really lowercase the G and just make him to like a meta being who's bigger and stronger and just knows everything all at the same time. They end up lowercasing the G and removing some of the key characteristics that would require divine attributes that actually make a lot of the arguments they want to use work. They really lowercase God and really don't understand God. It's very weird.
Yeah, and then that's where you get the sorts of objections which are like, if God is omnipotent, can he make a rock that he can't lift? And then you get a paradox, to which Feser actually replies later in this book, and he says, that's not what we mean by omnipotence. It's the power to actualize every potential, and also it's the power of pure actuality, to make every potential actual. And also, if God, a theist can escape this by saying, yeah, God can cause paradoxes. Get out of here. Like, obviously. Which is, yeah, of course, he can make a rock which it's too big for him to lift, and then he can lift it. He's God. Yeah, which are the two ways you can escape from this conundrum. But yeah, you sort of whereas to a Catholic, that's kind of a nonsense question. That's kind of a very, this is pure existence itself. What are you talking about? Kind of territory. It's like pure existence lifting a rock. Like, yeah, I guess.
Can God make a square? God make a square circle? That's the one I hear a lot. Could God make a square circle? And it's like,
yeah. Just because of the way my head works, the one that kept bothering me about this is, can God kill himself?
Man, you're gonna love the Gospels.
I'm gonna have to clip that one later for a sword. That was awesome.
But the quick answer to that is could God not exist? And again, it's not quite in this proof, but the short answer is no. God is the necessary being. So and like Bulgakov was saying about what we mean by omnipotence, it's not necessarily that God could do absolutely anything. It's that anything can be done, God can do. So right. God couldn't not exist. There's certain arguments in Thomism about what powers God can delegate. Right. I've heard the argument that people ask, can an angel create a human soul? And the Thomistic argument would be like only God has that power, and he couldn't even delegate it to some other being to do it. He's still omnipotent because that's everything that can be done. That's what omnipotent means. Every potency can be actualized.
Yeah,
by him.
every potent. It's omnipotent. It's every potency. It's in the name. So, for example, you can't make a square circle because that's not what a square is, and that's not what a circle is. You can't do that because that's not what they are. They would cease to be what they are if you changed one into the other, and vice versa. So that's but the problem of eternity that I see with a lot of Protestants, not a lot, just a few online, I don't know if that's representative, is that the eternity they ever think of, he is alive at every moment, T1, T2, T3, to T infinite. And that's how he's eternal. He just exists. He has existed as long as the universe, possibly before. Don't ask me how that makes sense in terms of time. But outside of time, they have the question, how are miracles possible? And I don't know if anyone wants to tackle that. I can, because Feser gives a short explanation in here in regards to Cambridge properties. That a change in the world, such as the creation of the world, we can regard it as maybe a miracle, because I don't know if... because again, this gets a little bit into the Twitter thread that Einkath did a while back on what the nothing that scientists, like Lawrence Krauss, say was the beginning of the universe. And maybe there is a natural explanation for that nothing, but there isn't a natural explanation for maybe why that nothing was there in the first place. And even then, what scientists consider the nothing is actually a lot of something. The physics Einkath can explain way better than I can. But essentially, if you regard that as a miracle, as a super actualization of potency, which is the definition of miracle according to Thomists, is not a violation of a natural law, but it's a part of a natural law that can only occur with God's direct help, then we can say, for example, the creation of the world is a Cambridge property. It's not a change in God, it's a change in everything else in relation to God. So a Cambridge property, just to give a quick example between humans, if we have Socrates and Plato is like a kid, and then he grows taller than Socrates as he ages, Socrates is still the same height, but now we can say that he has the property of being smaller than Plato, but yet Socrates is unchanged, despite him having this new property, or having a property change from Plato smaller than Socrates to Plato bigger than Socrates. That would be a Cambridge property. It's a property that is not in the thing itself, but it's a relational one. I just want to explain that because a lot of people get caught up. I did a long time ago, get caught up on, wait, if God is eternal and outside of time and he doesn't change, how can he have miracles happen with God? And essentially, he's already done it in a sense. At the same time, he hasn't, because you're still applying time to something outside of time. It's a very weird thing to think about, but that's how I conceptualize it.
God's relationship with time is one of those things that I've tried multiple times to research and study, and every time I get more than like an hour into it, I'm like, you know what? There's things I can do with my time I'm actually gonna understand. I want to try to focus on me I actually know.
We talked about it in DMs for a little bit, where
my view has changed since then. Like it's so like you have one view and you read one sentence, and like, oh, I gotta change that now. Mm-hmm. It's very. I need to read Augustine on it and kind of understand his thought. I know Augustine what's about in the Confessions.
One of the better analogies that I've seen, and it's not a perfect analogy, but I think it's apt, and I think it sort of helps with this, is sort of imagining again, it's a very limited analogy, but imagine God like the author of a book. The book can have a chronological passage as a beginning, a middle, and end. Things happen, things progress in time in the book, or then someone with the book there. They could be at any page at any point. They're not moving along page to page necessarily reading the book. They're not happening with the book. Mm-hmm. They are external to the book. And if they were to cause something to happen on one page, that's not happening in time. It's just the book is changed in that point. Mm-hmm. So they are external to the time moving through the pages
to the
of
time
book.
Series in the world of the book.
Mm-hmm.
Feser uses a similar example where he says an author who comes up with a story in a single instant. That would be kind of God. There is no passage of time for him as a thing in himself. Again, we get way more complicated when we get into the mystery of incarnation, but thankfully that is not what this live stream is about. I'm woefully underprepared for that one.
And again, that I think anyone would argue does require the work of revelation, as we're not going to be able to use natural theology to try and prove the incarnation is true.
No, we are not.
And that's not the goal of this. Is
mm-hmm.
The Christian or Catholic faith to be a specification of this, and must be a specification of things that we know are true about God.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, we're 46 minutes in, and we've covered the first 17 something of the
First half? I think
first
23.
half?
I think we got to
first
23.
half of the
Yeah,
first
and-
argument.
They'll speed up now. It's fine.
Yeah,
Until we
fine.
get to the
Until we get to the
Neoplatonic
Neoplatonic
God.
one. Yeah,
This
that's
is gonna
fine.
maybe be a 2-hour stream, y'all. If y'all are up for it,
I'm up
Well,
for it, but yeah,
maybe 5 episodes was better than 3 episodes.
we'll get there.
We'll get to who's y'all wait to read the next part.
Yeah, I think we're good on that.
Yeah. I think
We could probably say more on Eternal, but let's keep it moving.
yeah, please. I've already said too much. Let's go.
Okay, where were we at?
24, I think. Next page.
Yeah, next one.
There we go.
There.
If the purely actual actualizer were material, then it would be changeable and exist in time, which it does not. So the purely actual actualizer is immaterial. If the purely actual actualizer were corporeal, then it would be material, which it is not. So the purely actual actualizer is incorporeal. If the purely actual actualizer were imperfect in any way, it would have some unactualized potential, which, being purely actual, it does not have. So the purely actual actualizer is perfect. For something to be less than fully good is for it to have a privation, that is, to fail to actualize some feature proper to it. A purely actual actualizer, being purely actual, can have no such privation. So the purely actual actualizer is fully good. And Ayn Rand's thinking actually helped me to make sense of this one.
Mm-hmm.
And she is probably turning in her grave right now.
But yeah, this makes I think the perfection and fully good are perfectly good, perfect, and just perfect in itself. In scholastic metaphysics, it's the same thing. If you're perfect, you're fully good. There is no such thing that is perfect and evil, because evil is just a privation of being in scholastic metaphysics. So if you accept that, it just sort of follows. Thankfully, I'm not going to justify scholastic ontology of ethics right now. So I think unless someone has more comments on that.
The only comment I have is at Actual Grant from Condentius put up a post saying, "Does evil exist?" And a lot of people are saying, "Well, obviously evil exists," and they kept pointing like bad examples, and he didn't understand that evil being a privation of good is not exist in of itself, but is a privation of things that already exist, things that exist all good. And so there was like if people read it, if you put exist in quotation marks and read it in the scholastic light, they would. I think people would have got it because how he put it up was kind of like a little trick, but it was like 92% said yes.
Yeah, he was trying to trick people. I didn't see that poll, but that's I noticed that when I was doing a course in early medieval philosophy that the philosophers, they're not talking about the same thing in evil when you go from Augustine and when people like talk, or like let's say Marcus Aurelius or something. When they talk about evil, like Saint Augustine and the scholastics, when they say evil, they're talking about evil as a substance, as a thing in itself. Does evil as a thing in itself exist? And they would say no, that would entail a contradiction. I would need to go back to Confessions to read the passage, but that would essentially entail a contradiction, because something that is purely evil cannot be corrupted further, meaning it's better than the thing less evil than it, which can be corrupted, because incorruptibility is a good thing, leading to a paradox, essentially, is Augustine's reasoning in the Confessions. He probably goes deeper in that, metaphysically deeper in that in other books. I don't know which ones. But that would be the very basic reasoning of why evil as a substance cannot be a thing. Evil exists as a privations, because privations exist. People are, deprived of good. They deprive themselves a lot of the time. Everyone's a sinner. But as a thing in itself, no, evil does not exist.
And even there, like there's the language is kind of tricky, but to say that something exists as a privation is already sort of, the privation itself doesn't exist. There's just an absence of the thing. Like does silence exist? Does darkness exist?
Mm-hmm.
Things can be dark, things can be quiet, but what you're observing there is the absence of something that could be there. So that can happen. You can be missing that thing, but that's what the idea that's what we mean by evil is there's something missing that is proper to the thing is hard for people to wrap their heads around, but it's not there's not a thing there. Yeah. There's a missing there. There's a nothing that should be.
This is actually, I remember in Sanskrit philosophy, I actually talk a lot about this. Are absences real, metaphysically real? Are they a thing in itself? And because we're sort of trained to notice absences, like we notice, we're walking down a street at night. There's low light, no one's around. I don't hear any noise, something, maybe there's something wrong here. We're sort of trained as animals to notice absences. So they exist as mental concepts, certainly, and they exist as abstractions from real things, such as a privation, but they don't exist as themselves. They're not metaphysically real. I think that's it, unless someone has I guess we'd just say the Thomistic definition of perfection is all potentials are actualized. Or the thing is perfectly itself, which is also the Thomistic, scholastic, I should say, conception of good. So that's just the definition, because some people get stuck up on like, what does it mean to be perfect? It means to have all of your potentials actualized, to be purely actual.
Okay, then. Let's see, next one. Everybody read on?
To have power entails being able to actualize potentials. Any potential that is actualized is either actualized by the purely actual actualizer or by a series of actualizers which terminates in the purely actual actualizer. So, all power derives from the purely actual actualizer. But to be that from which all power derives is to be omnipotent. Mm-hmm. So, the purely actual actualizer is omnipotent. Whatever is an effect is in its cause in some way, whether formally, virtually, or eminently, principle of proportionate causality.
The PPC, famous.
The purely actual actualizer is the cause of all things. So the forms or patterns manifest in all things it causes must in some way be in the purely actual actualizer. Don't actually remember this part very well. These forms or patterns can exist either in the concrete way in which they exist in individual particular things, or in the abstract way in which they exist in the thoughts of an intellect. They cannot exist in the purely actual actualizer in the same way they exist in individual particular things. So they must exist in the purely actual actualizer in the abstract way in which they exist in the thoughts of an intellect. So the purely actual actualizer has intellect or intelligence, which was another big point that I want to clarify. Since it is the forms or patterns of all things that are in the thoughts of this intellect, there is nothing that is outside the range of those thoughts.
You know what? Let's just finish it, and then we can go back to this one to review, because it's just up until 50.
For there to be nothing outside of the range of something's thoughts is for that thing to be omniscient. So the purely actual actualizer is omniscient. So there exists a purely actual cause of the existence of things, which is one, immutable, eternal, immaterial, incorporeal, perfect, fully good, omnipotent, intelligent, and omniscient. But for there to be such a cause of things is just what it is for God to exist. So, God exists. And that's it. We've proved God exists. Atheism has dropped to zero. All in a day's work.
So I think we talked a little bit about omniscience or omnipotence earlier. I don't think we had much to add there, except again restate the definition of that. It's the ability to actualize all potentials, not to do anything that you can think of. So a lot of these paradoxes kind of fall by the wayside. The omniscience and the intellect, I think, is the really interesting thing to focus on, because that's a deep point. Golga, you said you had some that was one that you were sort of
well, because like I said, I started with a Thomistic proof, so I arrived to the conclusion, okay, there is a purely actual actualizer, there is an unmoved mover, but is it even conscious, is it intelligent? And the Aristotelian proof covers that. What was the wording again?
Yeah, this goes into the theory of forms.
Yeah,
because we were talking briefly, I guess it was right before the show started, about Plato a little bit, and the sort of correct understanding of the what is it he calls it, the world of forms, or the
world of forms.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's probably the hardest one to understand, and you sort of have to subscribe to some form of metaphysical realism to accept that one. Everything else you could accept just on the actual potency distinction or a similar distinction, which I think even secular analytic philosophers can subscribe to. such as with disposition and concrete. I think it's what it's called. Like, what's concrete is what exists. What's dispositional is what it can do, instead of purely inactual. You can sort of subscribe to that and get to everything else up until that point. If you don't subscribe to metaphysical realism, or you have strong doubts against it, then you sort of get into trouble. If you're a nominalist or a conceptualist, then things are sort of hard to parse there. But Ancaf, do you have a ready explanation for the theory, for the scholastic theory of forms?
Oh, something that I can give concisely.
Yeah, or else I'll just ramble on.
Please ramble. I have things that I want to add, but I think if you can give the background, that'd be great.
Okay, let me try. Okay, so I could actually go to Feser's book right now and get the very basics of your Aristotelian forms, but essentially, everything that exists participates in a form. The basic, let's say, argument for this, there's a few basic arguments. He gives like 20, like one paragraph once at one point. But one of the easiest ones for me to wrap my head around is that if things didn't participate in some form, we literally couldn't agree on what they were. It would be an insane miracle that we would agree this is a triangle, or if it's a crooked triangle, this is a crooked triangle. It's something which sort of resembles what it means to be a triangle, but it fails at being so because maybe its angles don't add up to 180 despite being enclosed or whatever, or it's not perfectly enclosed, or I don't know, or it's a squiggly line. And so you sort of have to have forms. The Aristotelian realism says that forms don't exist in some sort of world outside of our own. They exist in the objects themselves. They only exist as they're instantiated, and we abstract away other forms that don't exist by themselves. So, for example, man is a rational animal, while a dog is just an animal. And you don't need to accept these definitions. That man is a rational animal. You don't need to accept that as the definition of a man, but just for the sake of argument. If man is a rational animal, then in man, rationality and animality are tied together inseparably, while obviously rationality is not inseparably tied to dog. So in Aristotelian realism, we sort of abstract away, and in our minds, the animality or rationality exists abstracted away from other humans in our minds. It doesn't exist purely as in itself, separate from the rationality of people. The scholastic version of scholastic realism, the theory states that, well, then we still kind of have the same problem that we can abstract away and agree on what the abstracted away parts are. We wouldn't have that problem to agree that man is a rational animal, but when we talk about the animality of man, we would have the problem of, okay, how can we even talk about the animality of man if it doesn't exist? If it exists only in the mind, it is a purely nominal thing that we can't have access. It's not a real thing that we can have access to, and our minds can participate in to figure out what this is. And so the scholastic answers say Plato was sort of on the right track. Aristotle corrected him and supplemented something. But he took away, we kind of need a world of forms, but not as Plato envisaged it. We would need the world of forms, or all the forms, to be all tied together in one big complex of ideas, in just one thing, in the divine intellect, for us to be able to even conceive a thing. So there is a world of forms that our mind participates in, but it is the divine intellect itself. That's the very basics that I probably explained badly, and we will cover in more detail once we get to the Augustinian proof, which is probably my favorite proof because it's the most, it's the newest one, the one which I really hadn't heard. I'd heard it before from Augustine, but I'd heard it like a few years ago, and it's on the freedom of the will. It's like a 100-page essay by Augustine. It's a dialogue actually between him and a student, and it's very, very good, very light reading. Well, not light, but it's very nice to read. It's a very enjoyable read because he's actually a good writer. And it really feels like a good teacher talking to you and raising the doubts you would raise as a student, because it was probably based on a real conversation, several real conversations with a student. So I really recommend that, on the freedom of the will. But yeah, that's a very basic version that we get scholastic realism, that we sort of get from Augustine, who was very trained in Neoplatonic philosophy.
Go ahead.
We have a comment from Anglo-Libertarian. But guys, if God is weird, why would he need these 200 IQ arguments to prove it? Why can't he come down as human and tell us he's weird? We still listen to him well.
I don't know. That's a mystery. I don't know. I haven't figured that one out yet.
Yeah, they real nailed it there.
Oh, God. I think equilibritarian is just defeated deism, by the way. It's just the shot to the heart of all deists. Yeah, so adding a little bit to what Bulgakov said, first of all, I think it's the first time I've ever heard Augustine referred to as light reading in any context whatsoever.
He's enjoyable to read, I'll say
very
that.
enjoyable. It is. I've never considered it light. But the other, and this is sort of tangential to the argument again, but I think is really interesting, and I don't want to get too deep into epistemology here, but thinking about how the mind operates and how we grasp things in the mind, is that there's a real sense that if I see a dog or something like that, I take on dogness. I sort of get dog in my head somewhere. Like there's a change that happens in me that I know dog.
Yeah,
knowledge
is in the form of a dog.
Exactly. I gain the form of dog in my head. I don't become physically. Nothing about me changes, but there is dog in my head that wasn't in my head previously. Right. So the mind has this way of interacting with forms and gaining these forms in very interesting ways. And there's this sense that our rationality is again, this is why we're in the image and likeness of God, is that we have this capacity to have this mind that can contain these forms, is we can have the idea of form in our head. And then in a sense, our intellect is this sort of analogy for the divine intellect. It's obviously limited in some very key ways, and it's not simple. It's not as none of these other divine attributes, but that we have this capacity of becoming these forms that God has within the divine intellect.
Yes, that is the very basics of theory of forms and on the divine intellect, and why. And essentially, it's the argument for why the unmoved mover, the purely actual actualizer, must have an intelligence.
Okay,
I have cat in my head. I have cat in my head now because my cat has just decided to make his presence known. Hello. Do you want food? Tough shit.
So let's keep going. Let's start covering the neo. Bulgakov, if you do me a favor and before you wrap it up, if you could send me the formal statement of the arguments for the.
Yeah, go ramble on. I'll find it.
While he's doing that, because I'll ramble briefly, because the next thing that Feser goes into is a lot of the common objections, and he sort of handles each of those. Some of them are very common and very stupid. Like a lot of people will say, "Well, what caused God?" And they clearly didn't read any of the argument, because the entire premise is there has to be something that wasn't caused. But I will contain my ramble to as long as it takes Bulgakov to
take as long as you want. You get time.
No. I could do this for an hour. He goes into a lot of the objections are physics based. He talks about Newton. He talks about relativity theory. He talks about quantum mechanics, and it makes my blood boil. And I dug up a quote from the Principia, from Newton's Principia, where in the first couple of pages of the introduction, he's very clear that he's like, okay, yeah, I'm not going to talk about causes here. I'm going to talk about observable things and that these things happen and that we can describe them. Causes are there, but we don't necessarily know what they are, and I'm not trying to deal with those. And he makes this very clear distinction. He's sort of the first one to do this so well, as he can still understand. Yep, things were definitely caused. I haven't eliminated the idea of causality, because this is the argument people try and make. Is they'll say, well, doesn't Newton's second law disprove the idea that everything has a cause? Newton very clearly understood that wasn't the case, and that he's giving a mathematical formalism that is trying to describe causes. And because it's a mathematical formalism, it necessarily leaves behind, it doesn't include efficient causality. It has at most some kind of formal causality in the form of the equations.
It's the structure of the world, of change in the world, but it doesn't say what change is, what it changed from, and what it changed to.
And what we see is in the evolution of most of science, but particularly in the physics from 1600 whatever until the modern day, is that distinction has been forgotten. Is that we have this really nice structure that we can do manipulations on, and we can develop all these incredible, very accurate theories to describe things, but we've forgotten about causes. Causes aren't included. They're not in Newton's laws directly. They're not in Einstein's theory. They're not in quantum mechanics. And that's why quantum mechanics gets people saying some very, very strange things that don't make a lot of sense, because they're just saying, well, the math tells us this, and we aren't going to worry about the causes, so they must not be there. And they've, it's like the article that I wrote recently. I think hopefully we'll get it posted on Austro-Thomism shortly. And I had a little Twitter rant at somebody that was trying to hit on Gold Guy about Twitter rant. I did defend my boy for his natural theology approaches and just embarrass some really dumb atheists. But you get these ideas like, yeah, of course something can come from nothing, and they like, because the math says that you have nothing, you have zero, and then you have one, and there's no thought of, okay, well, if it's nothing, why does it have the property to make something? That doesn't sound a lot like nothing. And it's because, if it's not written explicitly in an equation, they sort of pretend that it's not there, or that they don't need it to be there. Whereas in doing any actual science, you sort of have this assumption, okay, yeah, effects proceed from causes. Any science you actually do is based on this. And a lot of modern science sort of pretends that that's not the case. And so many arguments arise from that because they don't understand what Newton himself understood is, we've had to leave some things behind to try and get, because we're trying to write down a structure, like Bulgakov said, that the math looks really nice and we can do nice. We can sort of turn the crank and write some nice software eventually that will do these things for us. But that's just the math. The other things are there that we've just sort of forgotten about them because they're hard, or because it's hard. It's easier if we don't have to keep track of them.
Yeah.
Doesn't cover some of the issues of scientism and the limits of science and the opening of scholastic metaphysics?
He does at length, and he also does at the end of his book when he's defending natural theology. In fact, I have right now, I can actually send you the picture, a very, very a very, very good syllogism that he does for why science can't be everything that science can't be what details all of reality of the world. I just sent it on the private chat. So last thing before that is the Neoplatonic proof.
Yeah, I'll read this one real quick.
But just put it on screen. Just share it.
Yeah,
it's very good.
I thought I was still saying on screen. Let me say it real quick. Trying to engage in the conversation and make sure everything gets one right. Is that zoomed in too much? Or is that there we go?
So you can read it.
The predictive power and technological applications of science are unparalleled by those of any other purported source of knowledge. Therefore, what science reveals to us is probably all that is real. Now, this I maintain is a bad argument. How bad is it? About as bad as this one. Metatechers have had far greater success in finding coins and other metallic objects in more place than any other method has. Therefore, what metatechers reveal to us, coins and other metallic objects, is probably all that is real.
Yes. Science and physics, biology, chemistry, they're meant to detect certain things about the world. They're inbuilt to detect certain things, certain patterns, and the underlying structure of change. But because of how they proceed, they're very, very good at that because of how they're structured. But that means necessarily they leave out all the other information. Another example is an engineer wants to figure out what's the carry capacity for an airplane. That doesn't mean that every object that comes into the plane is pure weight, even though that's what the physicist the engineer, I should say, is calculating at the moment and taking into account. They're actually people. They have qualia, they have experiences, or they have this shape, this size, and the carry-on luggage is this shape, this size, contains these things and doesn't contain these other things. And yet the engineer is not concerned with that. He's just concerned with weight capacity and distribution.
If anyone wants to see a good conversation on a good Catholic talking to someone who is probably who is a scientist and probably unknowingly holds to scientism, Bishop Barron did a podcast with Brett Weinstein and his wife.
Yeah, I watched a bit of that.
I love how they're talking about mass and numbers being important. He tries to sneak in the what's the argument called? The argument's called I can't remember what it's called, but it's like the uncanny consistency in mass proves God kind of thing. He tries to sneak that in there to get them to admit to how does it make sense that numbers and mass are so consistent unless you have God? And he suddenly tries to sneak it into them, and they just won't engage with him at all. They keep trying to move past it a bunch, and it's kind of hilarious.
Yeah.
I think they know where it leads, but don't want to.
I mean, yeah, there's a guy in full bishop clothes. Like, yeah, what did you think about this?
And they're just trying to ignore it.
Alert.
It was a very good podcast. It was very fun to watch. But
he's a very good interviewer. He's very good at just letting people talk. I was kind of
surprised, honestly. Like someone who's normally interviewed all the time, I didn't expect him to be a very good interview. But Bishop Barron again surprised me because he's apparently good at everything.
I mean, he's a bishop. I mean, he's probably had to listen to a lot of confessions. I think he's probably pretty good at just listening to people and asking them the right questions.
Yeah.
But yeah, we can move on to the Neoplatonic proof if you want to end up sometime today.
It's already tomorrow here.
Ooh. Sorry about that, man.
Ooh.
Let me share the screen again. Okay. Who wants to go? You want to read this one, or somebody else want to take it?
I can just go ahead.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds good.
The things of our experience are composite. A composite exists at any moment only insofar as its parts are combined at that moment. This composition of parts requires a concurrent cause. So, any composite has a cause of its existence at any moment of which it exists. So, each of the things of our experience has a cause at any moment of which it exists. If the cause of a composite thing's existence at any moment of is itself composite, then it will in turn require a cause of its own existence at that moment. The regress of causes this entails is hierarchical in nature, and such a regress must have a first member. Only something absolutely simple or non-composite could be the first member of such a series. So, the existence of each of the things of our experience presupposes an absolutely simple or non-composite cause. In order for there to be more than absolutely one simple or non-composite cause, each would have to have some differentiating feature that the other lacked. But for a cause to have such a feature would be for it to have parts, in which case it would not really be simple or non-composite. So, no absolutely simple or non-composite cause can have such a differentiating feature. So, there cannot be more than one absolutely simple or non-composite cause.
You want to continue or move on? Because I know most of our problems are with the first premises. But it's not that long. There's just one more after this. Go on, Kath.
So, do we want to? Is that a good place to stop? Because I do think we probably want to talk about most of this, and then the rest of it is going to be again trying to determine the divine attributes from that.
Yeah, I think here's the thing. I think if you accept premises, the first few premises, so especially 2 through 7, I think 1 is pretty undeniable that the things of our experience are composite. But we have monists and Spinozans, so that could be an interesting objection. But if you accept 2 through 7, I think everything follows. But it's 2 through 7 that really sort of melts my brain. So the problem with 2 through 7. So it's okay. So I'll read 2 again. The composite exists at any moment. A composite exists at any moment only insofar as its parts are combined at that moment. Okay, so a dog has to be a dog. It has to have a head connected to its torso, connected to its legs, connected to its tail. Fine. Okay. This composition of parts requires a concurrent cause. And at that point, I have to stop and say, but why? But why does it here's the thing. Is it an essentially ordered series or an accidentally ordered series, like a father and a son? So if the father gives birth to the son and the father dies, the son still exists. But if I'm moving,
hold on. Are we arguing about men giving birth now? I thought. Am I on the wrong
I
side of
assume
Twitter?
there's a mother in there. We're just not
right.
talking about her.
You said the father gives birth.
Perfect Catholic podcast. Never talks about a woman.
Talking about women is basically a sin.
We talk about Mary, and that's about it. That's the only one we're allowed to talk about.
Everyone but Einkaf is a Chartreusian monk. We've taken a vow to never even see a woman again.
Dream.
I need to change my profile picture, don't I?
What do you mean?
Because when you go to confession.
But yeah, at that point, I'm like, okay, is it not okay, so if father gives birth, ignore that terminology, ignore that. So a father has a son. Okay, done. I'm changing it. A father has a son. But father dies at some point in time. The son still exists because the son has his own causal power. Again, you go back, given that the son is also supported independently of the father by the unactualized actualizer, so he no longer needs the father to exist. But as we've talked about, an infinite chain needs the other part of the chain to exist. So if the other part of a chain stops existing, then the chain falls apart. Then that part of a chain falls. It's no longer there. And much like if I hold a stick with my hand and I use the stick to move an object, but I die, the stick no longer has any causal power to move the object unless someone else comes along, picks it up, and moves the object. So here's the thing. Isn't there something that sort of, at one point, if a dog is already combined after its birth and, it has the animal soul, it's supported by the unactualized actualizer to make it actual, does it need another cause to be composite, a concurrent cause? That's my issue with this. And I'm open to it being true, but I'm very open to it being true because Feser is an extremely good philosopher. But he doesn't go in depth enough in this book that I can sort of wrap my head around this. Comments, please, because this is It's the very first premises. Everything else follows, I think, perfectly from that. It's a valid argument. It's just that if you grant these premises, everything else follows. But if you don't, which is a few hard premises to grant, it doesn't. That's my issue with it.
Yeah, I'm not going to be able to help you. This chapter was only 12 pages long, and I think I read it twice, and I still don't fully get
it's
it.
the shortest chapter.
Yeah.
I was hoping you had the answer.
No, I just have questions.
So two things I'll say, because the obvious, or the most obvious one that I try and rely on is just going back to one of the other proofs. Is we can sit there and say, okay, there's a cause for these things. Like we just refer to the unactualized actualizer, but then we're not actually having a distinct proof. So I trying to take it on its own terms. I think looking at it in terms of something like material causality is that the wholeness of the thing has its I can't remember the word he uses, but the concurrent cause in its parts. Like the parts have to be in order for the thing to exist. So the existence of the whole is required by the existence of its parts. And we can say, then we can ask the same thing about the parts. Okay, well, why do they have their existence in this moment? Well, they have to have a cause in their parts, or in the material that is actualized in that thing. So that the dog can only exist because the cause of the dog in the material cause sense. Previously, we were talking about efficient cause, which is the more common kind we think about. In terms of material cause, the dog exists because its parts are there and can exist. Okay, well, why does the tail of the dog exist? Well, because the fur exists and the skin exists and the bone. And then we say, okay, well, why do those things exist? So each of those composite things has to have a material cause in the matter that forms it. Until, or not just even the matter. At some point, because I know at some point he makes reference to the form matter, the fact that we have, we don't just think about parts like we think of in a dog. We can also think about metaphysical parts like form and matter. Is to say, okay, what's the thing that holds the form to that sticks the form to the matter? Because if there isn't a cause combining those two, then the matter could be something else, or the form could be either not actualized or actualized in some other matter. That's about the best I can do is looking at it from perspective of material causality instead of efficient causality.
I agree with that, but here's the thing: doesn't that just collapse into the unactualized actualized argument? Because if you say every part has to have its cause, and in some sense, the joining of each part to the whole has to have a cause, doesn't this just mean Feser would agree, it is the unactualized actualizer, but at that point, I don't think it's a separate argument. I think the Augustinian argument is a separate argument, and it does eventually collapse into the unactualized actualizer, because then it has the whole same attributes, and it's the same thing, and at one point you derive that this intellect, which holds all the forms, is purely actual, and the PSR also eventually collapses into the unactualized actualizer, but this one just seemed... It either is a different argument and I don't get it, which is fine, or it's the same argument in, I think, a weaker rebranding, because it's open to more objections.
The similarities between the Platonic proof and the Aristotelian proof, how close they are together, really is proving Lloyd P. Garrison right that Aristotle was just another Platonist.
Yeah, it's very similar.
I thought you'd mention that. But to me, it seems like a relatively short reiteration of the argument that just starts from a different point and then proves how it ends up at the same place. It also melts my brain. So,
and I think, and I'm gonna probably be a little unfair to Feser, but I think he wants this in there because he wants an argument where the conclusion is the existence of a perfectly simple thing, divine simplicity being for me, a very mind-blowing, one of the most mind-blowing attributes of God, but one that he wants to sort of have separately derived. And we can talk about divine simplicity in a little bit because there's a lot there. And again, I think if we think about just physical things and we think about form-matter composites, it's the joining of those two being distinct from them being caused independently. Is that there's the form and there's the matter, and why are they together? Is about the best that I can do. Again, and again, later on, because I think if we go into some of the later steps, he starts talking about what things can either exist in the world or exist in the mind, or they can be a mind, or they can be an abstraction. And I think he sort of loses the plot a little bit in terms of, okay, are things in the mind composite or simple, or are principles composite or simple? And he needs to do a lot more sort of, and I think he wants to try and keep it kind of concise here. he has the other text we referenced, Scholastic Metaphysics, which he goes into a
Yeah,
lot more depth.
Oh yes, indeed. I'm almost halfway through, but yeah, he devotes like the first 200 pages are just the actual potency distinction and causality. That's all that it is. And he's only touched on 2 forms of causality, final and effective. That's it. He hasn't gotten to material, formal, and he hasn't even touched the world of forms. Then there's like 250 pages left or something like that.
So I think that to give him the benefit of the doubt, I think a lot of the argumentation for the Neoplatonic proof is in that, but he doesn't want to go into the metaphysical depth that he needs to sort of establish it here. And it ends up like, I think we all sort of found it just a little bit. Again, it's how is it, and how is it? Ironically, though.
It being him simplifying it made it more complicated to understand.
Yeah.
So, do you want to talk about divine simplicity? Because I know Einkath brought it up, and I wouldn't mind talking about divine simplicity.
Sure. You want to go? Yeah. We want to talk about? We want to finish the proof, or talk about some of the divine attributes?
I don't know. What are you guys saying? Finish the proof, or
let's go through. I think we're about halfway through, anyways. It's
a short proof. Just get through it, and then we have more stuff to talk about, including divine simplicity, because this ties in it being non-composite and simple. Ties in perfectly to that topic.
We were on the second page of that.
The second one, yes.
Okay, here we go. So I keep closing streams, keep closing tabs because of the weather here. I'm trying to make sure I don't crash the stream, and I keep having to go back and bring them back up again. Okay, there.
Yep.
There
right. No, that's the third one.
Nope. Page before that. Yeah.
Yeah, one before that. There we go. No, you were. Yep, there.
There we go.
Where are we at? Yeah, we finished
14.
the first page, right? If the absolutely simple or non-composite cause were changeable, then it would have parts which it gains or loses, which, being simple or non-composite, it does not have. So, the absolutely simple or non-composite cause is changeless or immutable.
Mm-hmm.
If the absolutely simple or non-composite cause had a beginning or an end, it would have parts which could either be combined or broken apart. So, since it has no such parts, the absolutely simple or non-composite cause is beginningless and endless. Whatever is immutable, beginningless and endless, is eternal. So, the absolutely simple or non-composite cause is eternal. If something is caused, then it has parts which need to be combined. So, the absolutely simple or non-composite cause, since it has no parts, is uncaused. Everything is either a mind or a mental content, or a material entity, or an abstract entity. An abstract entity is causally inert. So, the absolutely simple or non-composite cause, since it is not causally inert, is not an abstract entity. A material entity has parts and is changeable. So, the absolutely simple or non-composite cause, since it is without parts and changeless, is not a material entity. A mental content presupposes the existence of a mind, and so cannot be the ultimate cause of anything. So, the absolutely simple or non-composite cause, being the ultimate cause of things, cannot be a mental content. So, the absolutely simple or non-composite cause must be a mind. Since the absolutely simple or non-composite cause is unique, everything other than it is composite. Every composite has the absolutely simple or non-composite cause as its ultimate cause. So the absolutely simple or non-composite cause is the ultimate cause of everything other than itself. If the absolutely simple or non-composite cause had potentialities as well as actualities, it would have parts. So, since it has no parts, it must have no potentialities, but be purely actual. A purely actual cause must be perfect, omnipotent, fully good, and omniscient, bringing us back to the Aristotelian argument.
Mm-hmm.
So, there exists a cause which is simple or non-composite, unique, immutable, eternal, immaterial, a mind or intellect, the uncaused ultimate cause of everything other than itself, purely actual, perfect, omnipotent, fully good, and omniscient. But for there to be such a cause is just what it is for God to exist. So, God exists.
Yeah, okay.
It sounds a lot like the Aristotelian argument.
Yeah.
I'm really having a hard time drawing a distinction between them.
It becomes the Aristotelian argument at about point 35.
Yeah, he does eventually say, yeah, it has to tie in because potentialities and actualities are parts. You have a actual part and a potential part, so therefore it must be the same thing, and it has to collapse, or else there's two gods. There's a There is the Neoplatonic God and the Aristotelian God, so it has to collapse to the other one eventually.
Yeah.
And you do get to the Neoplatonic argument from the Aristotelian one because it has to be simple. It can't have parts. It has to be just one purely actual thing. So we do get to the same place eventually, as we should expect to. But it's just I'm not convinced yet that the argument he provides in this book specifically, maybe in other works, and I'm certain maybe if I read the original Neoplatonists, maybe that it's a sufficiently different to call it a different argument, and that the first two premises can't be, without losing any content, be just said to be the if things suffer change essentially. And change, and to have change is to have parts, is to be material, is to be so on and so forth. But you guys want to talk about divine simplicity, right?
I do.
Yes.
But before we hop into that, speaking of Neoplatonic proof and how the cause would have to be simple, I figured it'd be a good idea to say. Let me say this real quick. Can you see this?
Yes.
Oh yes.
Oh, this is from.
Can I hear it too?
It's counterintuitive.
Mhm.
Yep. From nothing. Of course, common sense doesn't allow you to get something from nothing. That's why it's interesting. It's got to be for the universe at all. Something pretty mysterious had to give rise to the origin of the universe. You can dispute exactly what's meant by nothing, but whatever it is, it's very, very simple. And
Oh, it's so good that he doesn't realize it.
Yeah.
Why
is that
very,
funny?
Very simple.
The problem is,
man.
why is that funny? It's really
Here's
so
the
that he
thing.
doesn't even know what he's walked into.
I could believe an atheist philosopher would say that and then catch himself and laugh at the joke. But the fact that he doesn't realize it is so delicious and so telling.
The quote
It's
Feser.
so telling.
The quote Feser, Dawkins wouldn't know metaphysics from Metamucil. He really, in Last Superstition, he really does take the new atheists, specifically Dawkins and Hayworth, to task. Like he really goes and they deserve it too for how smug and asshole, like the smug assholes, and they really deserve to be taken down a peg. And he does a great job of doing it.
Oh, I cringe when I was a smug atheist.
Oh yeah, same.
I have a lot to confess.
That first confession is going to be like what, 5 hours long?
Oh yeah, I think the priest's probably going to become a fucking alcoholic after that.
Trust me, whatever you have to say, they probably heard worse.
Speaking of confessing, I always love to tell my favorite confessing joke is that apparently one priest said hearing nuns confessing is like being stoned to death with popcorn.
I think I've heard that one before.
It's a good one.
It's really good.
Divine simplicity. Who wants to go first and talking about divine simplicity? Because I'm just not getting into it. I kind of got the gist of it, but I want to hear someone else say it to make sure I know what I'm talking about too.
It's a difficult idea to wrap your head around, and Feser does a good job again, very briefly. The rest of the chapter, outside of his original premises, I think he does a very good job on. Is we have this idea, okay, we have something that has that we say has intellect, it has power, it has goodness, and so okay, like aren't these sort of different things? Isn't it now a composite thing because it has all this different stuff to it? And if the proof and the previous one follow, we know it's got to be simple. And so what we sort of realize is that these are all in the existence of God, and they are all one thing. God just is. God doesn't have things. God doesn't do things. God is. He am what am. To horribly corrupt the Hebrew.
Feser has a decent, not Feser, sorry, Peter Kreeft has a decent formulation of it, which is to be God is to be, which is then we don't have to corrupt the Hebrew to do that. Say that.
But we sort of and Feser talks a little about like univocal and equivocal and analogical understanding, and that we say these things about God, that he has an intellect, that he has goodness, that he has justice and mercy, and all these things, and we talk about them analogically because they are just what he is. And we I've heard the idea of we sort of think about it as viewing them through different lenses. So we have if we have God being this white light, we sort of put a prism up and we can say, okay, yeah, there's the red and the blue and the green, but it's just God. And we are just putting different lenses over it, or different sort of filters to make it things that we can relate to. Because we don't have that simplicity. We are composite. We are, these things are distinct for us and in us. And so we try and understand the one, the the perfectly simple God, and we see these things that we talk about as either aspects or elements, or there's all the different language that gets used, but it all is just the one thing, and we try and understand it in different ways through the differentiation that we see in the world, that we see in ourselves.
Yeah, and I think divine simplicity is also, it's a very important doctrine because, I think it's hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. It's the Shema. I've butchered the Shema. There's like one verse which I've already forgotten there. But that's essentially the Shema. God is simple. The Bible's pretty insistent on it that God is one. But at the same time, Catholics especially, but most Protestants, I think, I know there's weird Protestants, but this is always a step too far for me when people deny the Trinity. So the simplicity of God is always it's very important as well when we affirm the Trinity, that it isn't a trinity of different gods, of different creator gods. Because in a lot of mythology, you'll have the primeval, like Greek mythology, you'll have the Titans, which are essentially, the gods before the proper gods, before, Zeus, Hades, and Poseidon, and all the rest. And then you have, and their parents are the Titans. They're what gave birth to the world, being these primeval forces of creations. And that's not what we're talking about with the Trinity. It's not three different gods who have this very intimate relationship. It's one God with three different persons in it. And a lot of our development of what a person is comes from trying to figure out the Trinity as well, especially Augustine and Boethius. I think the first definition of what a person is, a substance with a rational essence, is from Boethius. It's from Consolation of Philosophy. So it's a very mysterious thing, and it's very hard to wrap your head around. But I think it was Jeremy from Contra Gentiles, which has pointed out that the Hindus, actually, Adi Shankara specifically, came to a similar conclusion about I believe it's Brahma, Atma, and Krishna.
Brahma.
They're one soul with three different masks. I might be getting the Atman wrong, but I believe Atman is, I think, the soul of the world, the thing of which all creation arises. But Adi Shankara specifically came to through natural theology to a conclusion of a Trinity. So I think Grant actually would argue against Aquinas, because I think Aquinas argues that the Trinity requires revelation, but there is some philosophers who think the Trinity can actually be arrived at through natural theology. But that's far beyond my scope, far beyond my paycheck.
Same.
Something fun that I want to point out, and that Bulgakov touched on briefly, is that the Old Testament is insistent that God is one, and we're going through proofs most famously sort of established by the scholastics in the 1200s or something like that.
Yeah.
And it's one of the things that really just sort of, because again, what they're proving is not the Christian God, they're proving a God that is consistent with the Christian God.
Yeah.
And then when you look at the way that God refers to himself, or the way the Old Testament refers to God, they didn't have the benefit of Aristotle, but they say these things just, this is what we understand through revelation. And it ends up being like, yep, that's exactly right. That's consistent with what natural theology teaches us. And I think that's so, again, like we talked about the Tetragrammaton earlier. It's like, oh yeah, that's if I were going to try, I'm not going to do a better job than God did, but if I was going to try and give a name to God, that's a pretty good one.
Yeah, I am.
Yeah. It's like, okay, yeah, existence and essence are the same thing. Wow. And then they didn't really have any, again, this is pre-Socratic. This is they don't really have the philosophy or the intellectual development to understand these things deeply, and they get it exactly right. And it's just it seems beyond coincidental to me that it seems to all line up so nicely.
Yeah. If I was subsistence existence itself, that's how I would introduce myself to a prophet. I don't know if that's just me though.
I can't find the book, but there's a female. What's her name? It's gonna bug me because I can't find the book or her name. But there's a lady who wrote a book where she makes the biblical case for divine simplicity. She only uses the Bible and scriptural arguments to showcase why its divine simplicity is actually it's not just philosophically coherent; it's biblically true. And it's interesting book. I cannot for the life remember the title of it or who wrote it. If I find out, I'll put it in the description. But it's definitely, and I know something that gets thrown around a lot is that people claim divine simplicity isn't biblical and that it's philosophically coherent and Catholics are more philosophers and Christians because they have philosophy over the Bible, and this is completely stupid, incoherent to say because divine simplicity is I am who I am, and to be. These are all very things that coincide with the Bible, and you can make a biblical case for divine simplicity. But I just wanted to get it out because I know a lot of people who, when they hear this kind of divine simplicity conversation, goes, "Well, where is that in the Bible?" It's like, well, I am who I am. That's where it's at.
And what a detriment to your argument is. It's like, okay, yeah, sure, you prove this rationally, but it's not in the Bible, so why should I believe it? It's like that doesn't what? Like you said something about gravity.
Track.
Like it's like it's like this isn't. There's no revelation. If it's literally just from the things I directly experience. Why do you need faith on top of that? Like, why do you need to say, well, why should I believe that?
There are flat earthers whose argument is the four corners of the word of scripture in the Bible. I mean, there are people who like to view flat earthers and deny gravity because gravity is not mentioned in the Bible. There are some really solar scripture was a detriment for Western man's intelligence.
I mean, it reminds me of doesn't link back directly. It just reminds me of a weird back when I was an atheist. Religious guy, a Protestant, whose sole argument basically for Christianity was the Bible contains reference to actual historical events. And that's just, what?
So does Herodotus. I mean, he can become a Greek mythology now. I mean, that's just a really dumb argument.
Yeah, I think what's his name? Bishop Fulton Sheen also addresses this. It's like, okay, well, why do you believe the Bible then? And the Catholic answer is, well, it was written either by people who experienced it, or by people who talked to people who experienced it, or by a community of people which had a living memory of those miracles and those experiences, and who had a certain teaching, and that, there was, like St. Irenaeus, I believe he wrote very shortly after the first Gospels were written. They weren't even collected into the Bible at that point, yet he could make, using only arguments from Scripture and from what the Church taught, arguments against the Gnostic heretics. I believe it was the Gnostics at any rate. So there's perfectly coherent argument. I think what his book is actually against the heretics. I believe it's what his famous book is called. So just from very early Christianity, before the Bible, Christians existed, and they existed in a church, and a specific church, which it wasn't the Lutheran one, by the way, and and in this, it carried on this memory, and that's how we derive, and that's how we believe in the Bible. Partly, Feser also addresses this at a later point that miracles would be a sign of a prophet or someone who has the approval of God, of subsistent existence itself.
Have y'all ever heard of Francis Schaeffer?
You've mentioned him to me before.
I'm sorry, I'm just gonna have to duck out for a second and grab my laptop charger.
Oh, good.
Go ahead.
Francis Schaeffer is a Protestant historian, which to me feels like a contradiction in terms.
I'm sure there's a lot of good Protestant historians out there.
I know a few, but he wrote a book basically about, he tries to blame humanism on the Catholic Church. And one of his arguments is
Jesuits.
One of his arguments is that
you might have a point there.
He goes to several points. He goes to make the earliest days, and he goes, Christians predated the Church. The church was decision to create things like Gregorian. Like at the same time, the early church was humanistic. The Catholic Church was humanistic, but they were also wrong for creating Gregorian stance that were otherworldly. And he tried to, like, at the same time, say that kind of thing. Or a good example he gave was that Aquinas preferred philosophy to the Bible. And he has this guy in an Aquinas costume taking notes and just having him close the Bible and ignoring it. And my question for Aquinas had the Bible memorized. He didn't have that next to him. It was memorized. And he tries to explain Aquinas' philosophy. And it's very clear to me he's actually never read Aquinas. And it is. I recommend anybody listening go watch it. It's hilariously bad. Like obviously he has it's like a PBS documentary of Protestant propaganda. It's all people in very cheap costumes doing very bad acting, trying to explain. And of course, the savior of Western civilization to him is probably Martin Luther, because Martin Luther rejected the Church's humanism, which I could argue Martin Luther's faith alone is much more humanistic than anything Catholic Church held to. It's a really weird argument. When it comes to Protestants using biblical historical accuracy, or how to put this, I mean, Jeremy says it best to be Protestant to say the first 1,500 years of Christians got it wrong. And I don't think he's not wrong. He's right. If you're gonna hold today, you kind of have to reject the earliest people were all wrong.
I made a joke earlier about the Jesuits, saying that, maybe Schaeffer had a point if his target was the Jesuits. And just to continue harping on about them, Kraft has a wonderful joke where he says, the Dominican order was created to fight the Albigensian heresy. You don't meet many Albigensians around nowadays, so we can assume that they're a pretty good order. The Jesuit order was created to fight against the Protestants. How many Protestants do you see around nowadays?
Too many.
That's a great. I love that joke.
Sorry, at what point down the path of Catholicism do I get to call for a crusade to the Americas?
Right away. I mean, I did.
Do you get to? I don't know.
You'll need to. I think you'll need to climb up to the office of Holy Father for that one. But just by historical precedent.
You will be hailed as liberators, though.
By a few.
Speaking of bad arguments, has anyone ever heard the so there's a few Islamic arguments for why Islam is true. Most of them are there's actually some decent Islamic philosophers who get a lot right, and I don't.
Yeah, I can actually, if you guys, I actually have an Islamic argument from God from Aristotelian principles somewhere
I would love to hear that. But one of the earliest arguments that they would use is they would read the Quran aloud and say, "See how beautiful it's written. Only God Himself could have wrote this," and that was their argument.
Oh yeah, the Protestants of Islam.
So you said you had an Islamic proof, or an Aristotelian Islamic proof, Bulgakov?
Yeah, I can actually send it right now to the chat. It should be sent right now. Yeah, I had to summarize it from Ibn Avicenna's Salvation, I believe, the Book of Salvation. It's very rough. It's just my notes, but it's fairly easy to go through. But it talks about, it essentially also rejects the Spinozan monism. So his argument is essentially this: for two kinds of existence things, a possible existence and a necessary existence. A necessary existence exists through itself. It's self-explanatory. It's purely actual, essentially. A possible existence does not exist for itself, but exists through something else. So the basic arguments are the next steps 1 through 6 is there is an existent. Let X be an existent. Every existent is either possible or necessary, P or NE for short. If X is any, we're done. We have God. We have a necessary existence. If a P possible existence exists, which the world of our experience is, then a necessary existence exists, through which makes the possible existence real. If X is P, then an NE exists. Therefore, an NE exists. So we have to show 4 that if a P exists, then an NE exists. That's what we have to show. And the following, he goes through the various different arguments of how to show this. So I'll just go through it quickly. The totality of existence is the totality of all possible existence is either itself PE or an E. So the totality, we mean the universe itself, the whole thing, the composite of all the parts of a universe, essentially. So let's assume it is a necessary existence, the universe itself, to essentially go through a Spinozan style of monism. Well, Spinoza himself would probably reject this. If any exists through P, through its P parts, for its possible parts, then if one possible existence did not exist, let's say this dog did not exist when the universe as it is would not exist, then necessary existence would not exist. The n necessary existence is a possible existence, so we have a contradiction. So the totality of things cannot be a necessary existence. So let's assume the totality is a possible existence. Well, if the totality itself is a possible existence, then it must have a cause. So the composite of everything must have itself a cause. Let that be Y. Now, Y is either internal, it's either a part of a totality, or external to the totality. If Y is internal to the totality, let's say Y is NE, then it is a contradiction because the totality is P, and we get right back to a P, and a necessary existence exists through a possible existence, leading us to a contradiction, NE being a P. If Y is a possible existence, then it would be the cause of itself, and therefore a necessary existence. We get to another contradiction. So Y cannot be internal to the totality, the composite of all existent things. So let's say if Y is eternal to the totality, so we have to say Y is external to the totality. Since all possible existence are in the totality, Y must be a necessary existence. Thus, we have shown that step number 4 is correct. Consequently, we have shown that a necessary existence exists, QED. That's from Ibn Sina's. And he goes through a few of the divine attributes. He actually has a sort of a Feser-like structure. He then goes, this has to be simple. This has to have this and this and this and this attribute as well. So he actually has a very Aristotelian, very scholastic bent to him, Ibn Sina. I believe Aristotle might have read him at one point, or it was a Verres I might have forgotten. But I think this argument, it surges up later in other Islamic philosophy as well. It's a very Aristotelian argument.
Yeah, it reminds me very much of Aquinas' third way. I think it's at least the way I've seen it presented. It's a very similar argument, and I love the argument of the necessary being that God is necessary of Himself. Because we go back to the question earlier, could God kill Himself? Could God not exist? And we see no, He's necessary. He must be. Or you ask the question, could there be nothing instead of something? Are we just lucky that there happened to be something instead of nothing? No, God had to be. God could not be. And that's one of those things when I start trying to turn around my head for a little while, I go a little crazy because it's a little bit intense, but it's profound. Like, yeah, there has to be God, and God made everything else, but there couldn't have not been that.
Well, we've gone for an hour and 47 minutes. Anybody have anything they want to add before we wrap this up?
I think Hex. I think his username is Shinkfrien. I think he calls himself Hexen on Twitter. I think he says that Aquinas has read Avicenna. Yeah, I also thought that. I wasn't sure, but I think he references it at one point or another. I
think you might have said Aristotle. He's
okay, quiet. Yeah, okay. Yeah, too many A's.
Yeah, sure. And if you don't mind, I'm curious, Bulgakov, when was Avicenna writing? When would he have been?
Well, I will consult Dr. Google for that. I know it was before Aquinas, because this was in my early medieval philosophy class. 200 years before. So he was born in 980 AD and died at 1037. So about 200 years before Aquinas was born, was when he died. Wow. One of the reasons for that we get more Aristotelian arguments for God from the Islamic philosophers is that there was actually a Christian community in, I believe, the library of Baghdad, which were the ones where all the Islamic philosophers studied, which is where the last copies of Aristotle was still alive, which is why actually we don't have most of Aristotle's corpus. So a lot of, like, for example, Nicomachean Ethics was actually his lecture notes. We think it wasn't actually meant to be a book, which is incredibly impressive in and of itself. But that's, which is insane to think of. I came to Anima was similar, which is why it's like only 50, 60 pages. But it mostly existed through the Christians in the library of Baghdad. It was a Christian Syriac community. And a lot of philosophers actually make a reference to studying in that library with the Christian Syriac community. And it was only later where it was translated back to Latin and then moved back to Europe. Until that point, we were mostly stuck with Plato and Neoplatonists, which is why Augustine is very much most parts agreeing with the Neoplatonists and parts reacting against them.
As you always see so much of Aquinas, or so much of this ends up in Aquinas, because Aquinas is reading the translation of Aristotle from them. Like he only gets Aristotle through that sort of circuitous route. Because, like you said, it didn't exist in Europe for the longest time. Like none of his stuff survived in Europe.
Mm-hmm. We got like some. I say we, not being an European, but Europe got some not translations of Aristotle, but commentaries on him, like Cicero and other philosophers. So we had some idea maybe of Aristotle was saying, but they didn't have any of the texts of Aristotle himself.
No, I've actually been reading some Cicero, and I think he's someone we should eventually cover. I think there's a lot of political stuff from Cicero that'd be fun to cover on the podcast.
Yeah, the eternal Italian lawyer, Cicero.
Yeah. Gold guy, anything to add? Or any questions or anything like that? 'Cause I know you had some questions in the DM, so anything you want to bring up?
God exists. Go to church. Thank you, Anglo-Libertarian, for making the first video that started me down the rabbit hole.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Irate Libertarian, even though you're a cringe libertarian, for pointing me to that video. I will corrupt you to be a post-libertarian yet.
Did you not see his recent video? He's phoned NRX sort of. Like,
Yeah, well, he still subscribes to the
I'm talking
Libertarian Legal
about-
Theory.
yeah. But,
Just
No,
fair
I'm
enough.
talking about irate libertarian now,
Oh, okay.
good dude. I like that guy.
Yeah. but cringe.
Little quins. anyone who holds a strict libertarianism without incorporating at least a little bit of the stuff kind of has like a little question above. You know,
It's not itself that libertarianism is cringe. It's that libertarians are cringe. It's a very different thing.
I have to bring it up because this brings into it. Paper Statist commented on one of our posts. What was it at? He said, "Could God make a cool libertarian? Checkmate theist."
That's it. Yeah, point.
We're
There's
done.
no, actually, no, that's very easy to rebut. There is no potential in a libertarian to be cool. Therefore, God cannot actualize it. Done.
That's a squared
Too easy.
circle.
We got it.
Yeah, squared circle.
Okay. Well, why don't you guys give your plugs and then I'll announce what we're doing the next time.
Who goes first? You go first,
well,
little guy.
Yeah, I'll go first because by the time this is up, my account might be banned again. So follow my fifth Twitter account at BullionBoy22. I'll have to come up with another pun for the next one.
Well, I believe in your pun-making abilities.
Thank you.
Let's keep moving down the periodic table. We can crowdsource something.
Yeah, how many medals are left?
I think we got a few. You haven't been having accounts yet, right? We're gonna be like it's going to be like less and less precious metals. Like okay, now it's lead and tin and like
Copper guy.
boron. Yeah.
We get to francium eventually.
You start getting to the radioactive things.
Oh, we got
Francium,
Francium
cesium,
friend.
francium friend, cesium Caesar.
Okay, there's a few good ones.
We
We can keep you going for a while. You'll stay on Twitter for at least another 6 months.
Actually, my backup right now is Platinum Pratt. So
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
I like that one. Ironcath, what are your plugs?
Yeah. So at Eincath on Twitter, AnarchoCatholic.substack.com. Putting things on my Substack, cross-posting a lot of them to Austro-Thomism, which is currently located at Paleothomism.com. Hopefully we're getting that switched around soon.
I have been trying.
Caleb, when's that going to
Okay,
get switched?
so I will give a heads up on the website. I will give an update on the website.
How much do I have to bully you?
Bluehost is shit, and I absolutely hate using it. For some reason, when I go to edit the page, it will look absolutely normal. It would say, okay, here's the tabs to the blog, to the podcast links, to everyone's account. It looks great. Publish. You go if you go to the website right now, you have no way of accessing the blog. It has 4 tabs, and they're all just linked to the same exact page. And none of the other links are working. I don't know why. It will look fine in the editing page. The moment I hit publish, nothing sticks. And I have been trying for like 2 days now to fix it. I can't figure it out. I'm going to call him. I'm going to call Help Desk, get some Indian dude help me figure this out. I am not looking forward to it. But I'm going to get it fixed hopefully this weekend.
With that in mind, I think I don't know if there's any other if we have our hands out anywhere else, but I know Caleb has a Patreon. Sorry, send Caleb money to pay for web design.
Yeah,
make our webpage better.
Send me money to pay someone else to make the website better because I'm not.
At 50 per month, we'll make Caleb take a web design class.
We're just gonna make you take all the classes to do develop the skill set.
I'm down. Bulgakov, what are your plugs?
I'm at available username, how it's spelled on Twitter. I occasionally post to Austro-Thomism /Paleothomism. Just posted a new article exploring Peter Geach's thesis on good and evil, which is essentially a secular analytic reason for supporting the scholastic theory of privation being evil and fulfillment of being good, essentially. So go check that out. Workout. I don't know what else I'll write on at the moment, but I'm sure something will come up that's interesting to me. So for now, that's where you can find me.
Wonderful.
I'm going to add in real quick. As soon as I get a new draft of Caleb, I've got an article going up on atheism and mysticism, which are actually the same thing based on a lot of what we've been talking about today. And that will be going up shortly. So
it's a fun read. I look forward to publishing that one. A heads up, you guys know or not yet, but anyone listening, Connor Motel at Noah Sordy on Twitter, he's been on Tom Wood Show, has now joined Austro-Thomism because he's published 2 articles. He's working on a third. He's been added to the list of people working on it. And Popular Liberties also joined Austro-Thomism, so we have like 5 people now. So many articles appearing on podcasts. We'll really grow into the website. It's gonna be we're gonna saying it's gonna be great.
Well done. Good stuff. Congratulations. Take a fucking bow. I'm not kidding. Take a bow.
Yeah, I'm very impressed.
Yeah, it's this
really, random internet project that Caleb was starting by just asking on Twitter, "Hey, any other Catholics here? You have an interest in doing this thing?"
Yeah. It's been a lot of fun. I absolutely love doing this, and I can't wait to see where this goes because
I didn't expect it. It's not big, but I wouldn't expect it to even grow from like me raising my hand saying, "Yeah, I'm a Catholic. I'm willing to write some things and appear on some shows."
Yeah, we almost get 200 followers on Twitter, so we're going up. We're going to go get up there. And I have a theory that Catholicism is getting bigger in America. Monarchy is getting bigger in America. The more radical it is getting, and people seem to be returning to more a philosophical understanding of things. I have a feeling that our combination of NRX, libertarian, anarchist, Thomist, Austrian economics, we have a combination of a lot of things that are getting bigger. So I'm hoping we can really be in the zeitgeist of all that new stuff coming up. So it's going to be a lot of fun.
Take over the world.
That is the plan. I wanted to start a Pope as king. No, I'm kidding.
We go into full-on integralist.
Who was it? I remember I made a post about freedom of speech being a bad thing, and someone was like, "Well, you get to decide what's a lie, what's the truth." I'm like, "No, I'm not the Pope."
I think
and that just enraged the person.
I think Burderkist on Timeline Earth, one of their podcasts, made the point where he's just gonna stop taking politics seriously, and he's just gonna when someone asks him what's his political position, he's just like, "I don't know. I guess the Pope should make decisions. I don't know." It's just like, yeah, and not going to defend it. It's just like, yeah, I like the Pope. I guess I'm okay with him making decisions. It's okay.
For me, when someone talks politics to me and I don't want to talk with them, I just say, I want Amazon and Catholic Church to run the country. And they just normally leave me alone. It's like I want Jeff Bezos and the Pope to be a dual monarch. That's the goal.
I will convert Jeff Bezos. I will make him a bishop.
Do it. No, new goal. Elon Musk, first Bishop of Mars. Let's do it.
Mm-hmm. Archbishop. The Archbishop of America, Jeff Bezos.
So next time we do an episode, guys, we're going to cover the Augustinian proof and the Thomistic proof. The PDF for the 5 proofs is available online. I recommend reading ahead of us and reading the Augustinian and Thomistic proof so you can partake in the conversation and be a part of it and really have some. Because what's most fun about it is not just talking to you guys, but having like audience interaction and getting to respond to questions. It makes it a whole lot more fun.
The Augustinian proof especially will require reading fervor, I think.
Yeah. I'm going to get started on that one tonight because I spent this week just reading this book because I put it off for too long, and I'm going to get a head start on this next one. By the way, my name is Caleb Brown. I'm on Twitter at CalebBrown549. You can follow Austro-Thomism at Austro-Thomism on Twitter. Website's Paleothomism.com. We got a bunch of great articles. We got more articles coming out soon. I am putting the final details of my what's it called, libertarian case for patriotism. I'm putting the final details on that one. What started off was a Twitter thread. I realized Twitter threads trying to port the language over to an article just makes you sound like a douchebag, and so I've had to do a lot of changes to make it look more professional. But anyway, make sure you guys follow us, subscribe, like, comment, share. We're on Spotify at Austro-Thomism as well. Go become Catholic.